Welcome to I Love This Thing So Freaking Much, a podcast about passion. My name is Sophie Katz, and today I am joined by Merric, a theater and events freelancer. Welcome to the show, Merric.
Hi.
Hi. So, here is how this works. Merric will have 3 minutes to talk about something that they love. This can be a person, place, thing, concept, activity, anything they want. Our only requirement is that they love it wholeheartedly and want to tell us why. Are you ready, Merric?
Yes.
Good. Got my timer here. Now, what do you love so freaking much?
Ferns. I really like ferns, and I feel like that seems weird often, but I don't know. Of the different types of plants, I just think they're the most fascinating and interesting. And so I thought I would tell you about them today. I guess it's important. There are 4 different kinds of plants. There's bryophytes, which is like mosses. There's pteridophytes, which are like ferns and horsetails and a couple of related species. There's gymnosperms, which is like pine trees. And then there's angiosperms, which is basically every other plant that you know, anything that flowers. And they're all broken apart differently in the way they evolved over time. But even though ferns were one of the earliest types to evolve, I just think they are the coolest. Mosses are really simple and don't have a lot going on. Love them still, do love mosses. But ferns is where we first start to see vascular tissue, so being able to move fluids through them, like water and also sap, making nutrients out of photosynthesis. And so they're able to get big, how mosses are really tiny. They can't move things around in their bodies. Body's not quite the right word, but their self. And so they have to stay really small and condensed. But ferns are where we start to be able to get really big. And we start getting different organ differentiation. That's one thing. Roots and stems and leaves are all different plant organs. So are flowers, but that's where we get into some of this. Ferns don't have flowers, which is part of, really weird but cool thing that I really like about them. So they, in particular, all plants reproduce by this thing called alternation of generations, which is where we get into what really makes ferns different. It's basically, there's 2 different kinds of generations. There's a gametophyte and a sporophyte. And basically the gametophyte makes gametes, which are eggs and sperm. And the sporophyte makes spores, which are spores, I guess. And so the fern that think of the big frond leafy part, that's the sporophyte generation. And so on the underside of those fronds, they make little spores and sort of drop them out. And then the spore grows into this gametophyte. It's called a prothallus, and it's this little small thing. It's heart-shaped or sometimes kidney-shaped, but usually more heart-shaped.
Thank you so much for telling us about ferns today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Could you tell me, because your interest in these different plants is very clear. Could you tell me, how did you first get interested in ferns? Was there a class where you learned about them, or how did that get started?
Yeah, so I took AP biology in high school because I wanted to go into genetics in college. And so we got into the botany section and we really dove into each of those big 4 types of plants. And we had to know the reproductive life cycle of all of them. And the big thing, how ferns, in ferns, the fact that the 2 generations are nutritionally independent. It's not cells that are attached to the other thing. It's almost their own, not almost, they are their own separate organisms, that I was just this is wild. What if people were like that? This is the coolest thing. And everyone was Merric, what are you talking about? We have to study this for the test, but I was no, this is wild and I love it.
What if people were like that? What would that entail?
Oh, it would be so imagine a pregnant person, right? But
Mm-hmm.
instead of giving birth the normal way, it would be sort of out of their, when it's birth time, out of their body sort of explodes this giant, huge towering thing, maybe kind of humanoid, maybe not, because it's somewhat different. And then that thing makes little human babies out of its armpits that just fall to the ground and eventually grow up into humans that then have intercourse and make a baby that then becomes this giant thing. Like it's this like going back and forth. That's the really interesting thing.
That is interesting to imagine. And it's also interesting for me to, 'cause when I think about flower and how flowers reproduce, I don't usually think of that as at all similar to how humans reproduce or other animals, but it's definitely closer than what a fern does.
Kind of. I mean, it flowering plants do the same thing as ferns, but it's much more solidified. So like the pollen then like making sperm, but like it's pollen, it's not like an entire other being, and like there's some other cells in the ovary part of the flower. It's not like it's a separate living thing. Like it's like a few cells here and there that help make those gametes to then make the sporophyte. Like it's much more condensed, and that might be why they like evolved to be like the most prolific plant, is because maybe that works better than this like very separate alternation. But I don't know. I think the ferns are more interesting because of that.
So it's the ferns that are the most prolific plants?
No, it's flowering plants.
Ah,
Ferns were for a while. I mean, that's where like you see them in a lot of like dinosaur pictures. The like, I mean, starting want to say in the Devonian period, but like at very least like Jurassic and Cretaceous, they were like really dominant. And that's where like Stegosauruses lived entirely on ferns.
mm-hmm.
Then it got warmer and drier. They needed to be really wet to do a lot of this reproduction. Like it requires a lot of like moisture to be able to have the various like parts meet each other when they are in that other generation, which is why you see them a lot in like forests and swamps and less so in like deserts. No, flowers were able to adapt to more environments over time.
Sounds like ferns, like the dinosaurs, are very much a part of how we can look at the world's history.
They are. And some of them are like still around from some of those earlier times. Like not exactly the same, but there's a lot more like similarities in like current families as those families. And they're a lot closer than like, I don't know, birds from dinosaurs or humans from like little tiny weasel things. There's a lot more retained in that genetic function.
What are some ferns that we could find around today?
Resurrection ferns are an interesting one.
That's an amazing name.
It is. They will like kind of dry out and come back when there's a lack of moisture. That's really interesting. That's where they get that name. I know there's a lot of like Boston ferns tend to be like a common house plant that people have. I had one. It died because I did not keep it moist enough. You know, that's true. I mean, that's something that like, I don't know if you've heard of like Wardian cases.
I have not. What is that?
So that's like in the Victorian era when British people were like, ooh, we colonized this place and they have neat plants. We're going to try to grow them in England now, which was something they did a lot. They wanted a lot of these tropical plants, but they didn't have a way to like keep them moist or out of like London's pollution, because like also the early industrial period. And so like Wardian case was like the early terrarium or like early greenhouse where it was able to like seal the plant off to like keep in a like different environment, which is where greenhouses eventually came from.
Mm-hmm.
If Victorian people didn't get really into ferns and stuff, then we wouldn't have all of that to be able to keep our plants alive.
So they're an integral part of like scientific history too.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know why the Victorians loved ferns so much. Probably not the same reason as me, but it's still cool.
Do you have any advice if someone else wanted to keep some ferns and have a little more success perhaps than you did? What advice would you give them on how to take care of them?
I would say keep it moist. Maybe manage your depression better so you can keep it moist. That's helpful for like those kind of like daily tasks. But yeah, no, like lots of like misting is usually pretty helpful, as well as watering. Like they need both.
Is there anything that you don't like about ferns? And if so, how do you handle that?
I don't know if it's not liking, but I wish there were more of them. That's not how evolution kind of panned out.
Yeah.
But like sometimes I kind of think about like, what if we replaced like grass is a flowering plant. Most trees are flowering, like not pine trees, but like woody trees are like flowering plants. You know, everything is. And I'm just sort of like, what if ferns got to do that? Like, what if we had like big tree ferns and little grass ferns? Like, what if they're the ones that made it? In which case, I mean, we'd have a much more like humid world probably, among other things. I guess I just wish there were more of them. But then I guess even though that there's not, it gets kind of exciting. Like if I see like a fern growing somewhere when I'm out, I'm just like, yeah, fern.
Yeah, it sounds like part of the excitement for you is that ferns are different from the other plants. And so maybe the rarity and the specialness adds to that excitement a bit.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, not to say that I don't like other kinds of plants, because I also do, I promise. I love all plants so much.
But it would be cool to have a whole lawn made of ferns.
It would.
Merric, thank you so much for telling us about something you love today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. If you would like to learn more about ferns or our guest, Merric, you can find their social media information in the episode description. And don't forget to use the hashtag #LoveThisThingCast to tell us about the things you love. I Love This Thing So Fricking Much is a production of Through the Window Media. This episode was directed by Sophie A. Katz and edited by Melissa Block. You can find us at Through the Window on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Tumblr. That is THROU, the window, at all those social media sites. Be good to yourself, be kind to each other, and you'll hear from us again soon.